The Crimean Tatars have lived in Crimea for a very long time, 1,000-ish years roughly, and in 1441 founded their own state, known as the Crimean Khanate. They speak a Turkic language, are a mostly Muslim people, and despite the name Tatar, they aren't closely related to the Volga Tatar people in the southern Ural Mountains. In the 1770s, Catherine the Great sent Russian settlers into the Crimean Khanate, which infuriated the locals, but eventually gave the Russian Empire the excuse to invade and annex Crimea in 1783. From that moment on, Russia's successive regimes have followed a similar pattern: force Crimea to become more and more Russian, and then use that Russianness as an excuse to occupy it. According to a 1785 census, when Russia first colonized Crimea, Crimean Tatars made up 84% of the population, while Russians made up just 2%. For most of a century, Russians remained a small immigrant minority on the peninsula, but by the late 1800s, the Russian and Crimean Tatar populations were roughly equal. This is partly because a lot more Russians had arrived by then, but also because Crimean Tatars were repeatedly forced to leave in huge numbers. During the chaos that followed the 1917 Russian Revolution, the people of Crimea declared independence, creating the Crimean People's Republic. Its government was multi-ethnic, and it had a legislature known as the Kurultai. It didn't last long, however. Bolshevik forces captured Crimea less than 2 months later. Life for Crimean Tatars under Soviet rule was brutal. Between 1917 and 1933, an estimated 150,000 Crimean Tatars, roughly half the total population, starved to death or were expelled. This wasn't enough for Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin, however, who opted for full-on genocide. In May 1944, right at the height of World War II, Soviet secret police forced roughly 200,000 Crimean Tatars onto cattle trains, relocating them to Uzbekistan, then also part of the Soviet Union. Thousands died during the journey, and thousands more died in the harsh conditions they found on arrival. And of course, their property back in Crimea was confiscated. As with other genocides, the Soviets justified their crimes with racist arguments. Crimean Tatars were accused, as a people, of being traitors, and of collaborating with Russia's enemies. And after the Crimean Tatars were deported, thousands of villages with Crimean Tatar names were given new Russian names to erase all evidence they'd ever existed. It's easy to see how the Crimean Tatar people could have disappeared at this point, but they endured. And in 1989, right before the Soviet Union collapsed, Crimean Tatars were finally allowed to return home, and roughly 277,000 of them, about 12% of the total population, live in Crimea today. Administratively, Crimea has been part of Ukraine since the 1950s, and after Ukraine became independent in 1991, the Crimean Tatar people created a second Kurultai, led by an executive body known as the Mejlis. The Mejlis, led for many years by Mustafa Jamilev, has campaigned for Crimean Tatar rights and fought for restitution of the land that they lost during the 1944 deportation. I think it's fair to say this process was taking longer than Crimean Tatar leaders would have liked, but there has been some progress. Crimean Tatars are engaged in Ukraine's democratic process, and many of the leaders have served as deputies in the Ukrainian parliament. And in 2014, that parliament recognized Crimean Tatars as an indigenous people, and the Kurultai and Mejlis as its representatives. Russia's decision to occupy and annex Crimea again hasn't just been a setback for Crimean Tatars, it has put them squarely in the crosshairs of yet another Russian empire that wants total control of Crimea. The Mejlis, temporarily based in Kyiv, are very clear that they want Russia's occupation to end. Russia has responded by banning the Mejlis as an extremist organization and issuing arrest warrants for its leaders. Life for ordinary Crimean Tatars under Russian occupation has been grim. One of the first acts of the occupation regime was to order Crimean Tatars to vacate the land they had settled in on their return from Uzbekistan. According to Human Rights Watch, they are also subject to harassment, arrests on trumped-up charges, and torture. A group of local lawyers known as Crimean Solidarity has spent the last 8 years defending dozens of Crimean Tatar political prisoners from within Russia's legal system. It's an uphill battle. For the Crimean Tatar people, liberation from Russian occupation cannot come soon enough. How long it will take is hard to know, but there's one thing we do know for sure. Perhaps no other people on Earth have more experience enduring and surviving Russian occupation than the Crimean Tatars.